The sun in the Montana Territory, high summer, it don't just shine, it presses down on the cracked earth, on the sparse grass fighting for life, on the shoulders of a man trying to wrestle a living from a patch of ground that God seemed to favor mostly with rocks and wind. That man was Caleb Hayes. Picture him, mid-30s, lean as a fence post from hard labor and lean meals, sun-browned skin stretched tight over high cheekbones. His hands weren't calloused, they were sculpted by work, thick, scarred, ingrained with the dirt of his claim. He moved with an economy born of weariness, every swing of the axe, every turn of the shovel measured against the energy it cost. His homestead wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built himself, timbers hauled and notched with painstaking care, mud chinked tight against the bitter winds that would surely come. A small barn, leaning but defiant. A plot of fenced land, maybe 40 acres wrested from the prairie, where he coaxed meager crops of corn and potatoes from the reluctant soil. It sat nestled against the foothills of the Bridger Mountains, miles from the nearest town, a solitary outpost against the vast indifference of the landscape. The silence out here wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. It listened to the rasp of his breath, the thud of his axe, the creak of the cabin door. It was the kind of silence that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful, if he didn't have something anchoring him to the earth. Caleb's anchor was simple: survival. The stubborn refusal to be beaten by the land, by loneliness, by the ghost of failed dreams that brought him west like so many others. He rarely thought beyond the next season, the next harvest, the next repair needed before winter clamped down hard. It was a life stripped bare, reduced to essentials: water, food, shelter, work, and more work. Now, picture something different. Miles away, closer to the bustling, burgeoning town of Bozeman, sprawled across acres that made Caleb's plot look like a postage stamp, lay the Ainsworth spread, rolling grasslands dotted with prime cattle, timber stands marching up the hillsides, water rights secured by foresight and fortune. And at the heart of it, a ranch house that looked less like a frontier dwelling and more like something plucked from the civilized East. 2 stories, wide porches, glass windows that caught the afternoon sun like diamonds. This was the domain left behind by the late Jeremiah Ainsworth, a man who'd come west with ambition and canniness, carving out an empire before a sudden fever carved the life right out of him 6 months prior. And presiding over this empire now, like a queen on an unexpected throne, was his widow, Eleanora Ainsworth. She was younger than Jeremiah had been, perhaps just shy of 30, with hair the color of dark honey and eyes that held a surprising depth, a mixture of sorrow, intelligence, and maybe, just maybe, a restless yearning. She'd come west with Jeremiah 5 years earlier, a cultured woman from Philadelphia, dropped into the raw landscape of Montana. She'd learned to ride, to manage household accounts that rivaled a small bank's, to endure the vast silences and the rough edges of frontier society. But she remained, in many ways, an outsider. Respected, yes. Deferred to, certainly. But known? Truly known? Likely not. Now, draped in the requisite morning black that seemed both formal and isolating against the backdrop of the rugged land, She moved through the grand rooms of the ranch house, overseeing staff, conferring with the ranch foreman, a stern, capable man named Silas Croft, who had served her husband loyally, and managing the Ainsworth Mercantile in town through intermediaries. She was wealthy, powerful by territorial standards, seemingly secure. But wealth, Caleb could have told her had their paths ever crossed, is a poor blanket against the cold of loneliness. She stood often at the tall windows, looking out at the land her husband had conquered, feeling less its master and more its captive, bound by duty, expectation, and the invisible cage of her social standing. The town whispered about her, of course. Would she return east? Would she remarry? Speculation buzzed like flies around honey. Eligible ranchers, ambitious businessmen in Bozeman, even the slick territorial lawyer who handled the Ainsworth estate, Mr. Alastair Finch, all watched her, waiting, circling. Eleonora saw the watching eyes, felt the weight of their assumptions, and retreated further into a polite, reserved dignity that kept the world at arm's length. Caleb Hayes knew of the Ainsworth spread naturally. Everyone in the territory did. He'd seen the grand house from a distance once or twice when forced to ride closer to Bozeman for supplies he couldn't grow or make himself. It looked like another world, impossibly remote from his own hardscrabble existence. He knew of Jeremiah Ainsworth's passing. News traveled, even to isolated homesteads. He felt a fleeting, abstract pity for the widow, imagining her alone in that big house. But his own struggles were too immediate, too pressing, to allow for much thought beyond his own fence line. He needed seed corn, salt, and maybe, if the trapping had been good enough, a new axe head. The trip to Bozeman was a full day's ride each way, time away from chores that piled up like snowdrifts in winter. He usually traded furs or surplus potatoes at the smaller trading post miles south, avoiding the bustle and the higher prices of the Ainsworth Mercantile. But his axe handle had split clean through, unusable, and the trading post rarely stocked quality tools. Bozeman, and likely the Mercantile, was unavoidable. He saddled his sturdy but aging mare, Bess, packed a meager lunch of jerky and cold biscuits, and set off just after dawn. The air cool and sharp, the mountains etched clear against the pale sky. The ride was long, dusty. He passed sprawling ranches, their herds grazing peacefully, stark reminders of his own small scale. As he neared Bozeman, the traffic increased. Wagons, riders, even a fancy enclosed carriage that spattered him with mud from a recent puddle. He felt out of place, his clothes worn and patched, his face grimed with dust and sweat. He tied Bess to the hitching rail outside the Ainsworth Mercantile, the largest building on the main street, its painted sign proclaiming its dominance. Taking a deep breath, bracing himself for the subtle condescension he often felt in town, he pushed through the doors. The contrast was immediate. Cool, dim air after the glare outside. The smell of milled lumber, coffee beans, bolts of cloth, leather goods, canned peaches from the east. 100 scents mingling, overwhelming after the clean simplicity of the prairie air. Shelves reached high, laden with goods he could only dream of affording. Clerks in clean aprons moved efficiently, and standing near the back, speaking quietly with a well-dressed man whose posture radiated self-importance, Alastair Finch The lawyer, though Caleb didn't know his name then, was Eleanora Ainsworth. She was dressed in mourning black, yes, but the fabric was rich, hinting at quality even in its somberness. A small, veiled hat perched on her dark, honey hair. She turned slightly as Caleb entered, her gaze sweeping past him with polite indifference, then returning to her conversation. Caleb felt a flush rise up his neck. He was acutely aware of the dust on his boots, the patch on his knee. He averted his eyes, heading towards the hardware section, wanting only to get his axe head and leave this world of quiet wealth and unspoken judgments behind. He found the axe heads, testing their weight, examining the steel. He selected one, checked the price tag, winced inwardly, but knew he needed it. As he turned towards the counter, he saw that Eleanora Ainsworth was now speaking with the head clerk near the front, her voice low but clear. The lawyer had departed. Caleb waited awkwardly, holding the heavy axe head, feeling the eyes of other customers flick over him. Finally, the clerk finished his conversation with Mrs. Ainsworth and turned to Caleb, his expression carefully neutral. "Help you?" Caleb placed the ag head on the counter. "Just this." The clerk rang it up, the price even steeper than he'd feared. Caleb pulled out his worn leather pouch, counting out the coins slowly. He was a few cents short. He felt the heat return to his face, a mortifying wave of shame. He started to apologize, to say he'd have to put it back, when a quiet voice spoke beside him. "Add it to my account, Mr. Henderson." Caleb looked up, startled. Eleanora Ainsworth stood there, her veil slightly lifted, revealing eyes the color of deep moss, surprisingly direct. She wasn't looking at Caleb with pity, but with a simple, matter-of-fact kindness. "Thank you, ma'am," Caleb stammered, flustered, "but I can manage." "Nonsense," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Consider it a neighborly gesture. Good tools are essential out here." She gave him a slight nod, then turned and glided towards the door, leaving Caleb standing stunned at the counter, the clerk already making a note in a large ledger. He quickly gathered the axe head, mumbled his thanks to the clerk, and hurried out, feeling clumsy and indebted. He saw her stepping into a waiting buggy, driven by her foreman, Silas Croft, a man whose stony expression seemed to take in Caleb's rough appearance with disapproval. As the buggy pulled away, Eleanora glanced back, her eyes meeting Caleb's for a fleeting moment across the dusty street. Then she was gone. Caleb stood there for a long minute, the weight of the axe head heavy in his hand, the unexpectedness of her gesture unsettling him more than outright scorn would have. A wealthy widow paying the difference for a poor homesteader's axe head. It didn't make sense. It broke the unspoken rules. He shook his head, mounted Bess, and turned back towards the long ride home, the encounter replaying in his mind. Eleanora Ainsworth's quiet voice and moss-green eyes lingering long after the dust of Bozeman was behind him. Life settled back into its hard rhythm on Caleb's homestead. The new axe head bit deep into timber. The handle he fashioned himself felt sturdy and true. He worked from sunup to sundown, the brief encounter in Bozeman fading into the background noise of survival. He didn't expect to see Eleanora Ainsworth again. Their worlds were orbits apart, intersecting only by the rarest chance. Then, a few weeks later, chance intervened again, this time closer to home. A late summer storm rolled in violently from the west, unleashing torrential rain and hail the size of robin's eggs. Caleb secured his cabin, brought Bess into the small barn, and rode it out, listening to the wind howl like a hungry wolf. When the storm passed, leaving behind bruised skies and a sodden landscape, he went out to check his fences. Down near the southern edge of his property, where it bordered the vast, unfenced Ainsworth Range, he found trouble. The creek, normally placid, had become a raging torrent, tearing out a section of his fence, and worse, gouging a deep cut across the rough track that served as a secondary access road for the Ainsworth Ranch, a route sometimes used by their wagons heading to timber stands further up the valley. As he was assessing the damage to his own fence, a rider appeared, picking his way carefully through the mud. It was Silas Croft, the Ainsworth foreman. His usual stern expression deepened by frustration. "Hayes," Croft grunted, nodding curtly without dismounting. "Seen the washout?" "Just found it," Caleb replied, gesturing towards the ruined track. "Creek took out my fence too." Croft surveyed the damage, his lips tightening. "Need to get a timber wagon through here tomorrow." "This'll stop us cold." Ainsworth hands are spread thin, fixing damage closer to the main house. He looked at Caleb speculatively. "You any good with timber work? Shoring things up?" Caleb hesitated. He needed to fix his own fence, tend his soaked fields, but he also remembered the few cents Eleanora Ainsworth had covered for his axe head. A debt, however small, felt like something to be repaid in kind out here. "I reckon I can rig a temporary bridge," Caleb said slowly. "Enough to get a wagon across, at least. Take me most of the day." Croft looked surprised, then nodded, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. "Mrs. Ainsworth will see you're compensated for your time." "No need," Caleb said quickly. Perhaps too quickly. "Just returning a favor." Croft raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "Suit yourself. I'll send a couple of lads down later to help clear debris once you've got the main structure in place." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving Caleb alone with the ruined track and the prospect of a long day's heavy labor that wasn't strictly his own. He set to work, felling suitable small trees nearby, dragging them to the washout, using skills learned over years of solitary building and repair. It was backbreaking work, wrestling heavy logs into place in the thick mud, securing them with rope and makeshift wooden pegs. The sun beat down, steaming the damp earth. By mid-afternoon, sweat dripping, muscles aching, he had constructed a rough but sturdy bridge across the gouged-out section of the track. As he was driving the last securing peg, he heard another horse approaching. He looked up, expecting Croft or his men, and froze. Eleanora Ainsworth sat elegantly on a fine bay mare, watching him. She wasn't dressed in black today, but in a practical, dark green riding habit that somehow made her look less remote, more approachable. Silas Croft sat his horse a respectful distance behind her. "Mr. Hayes?" Eleanora called out, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. "Mr. Croft informed me you were undertaking this repair. I came to express my thanks." Caleb straightened up, wiping sweat and mud from his brow with the back of his hand, suddenly aware again of his rough clothes, his grimy appearance. "Ma'am," he managed, nodding awkwardly. "Just finished getting it stable." She urged her horse closer, inspecting his handiwork. "It looks remarkably sturdy. You have quite a skill with timber." "Have to, living out here," Caleb said simply. "Build it yourself or do without." She looked around at his small homestead, visible just up the slope. The neat cabin, the tidy woodpile, the struggling but tended fields. Her gaze was thoughtful, curious. "It seems you do a great deal yourself, Mr. Hayes." There was an awkward silence, broken only by the gurgle of the receding creek. Caleb shifted his weight, unsure what to say. Silas Croft cleared his throat pointedly. Eleonora ignored him. "Mr. Croft mentioned you declined compensation," she said, her moss-green eyes meeting his directly. "You said something about returning a favor?" Caleb felt himself flush again. "The axe head, ma'am, at the mercantile." I appreciated the gesture. A small smile touched her lips, transforming her usually reserved face. "Ah, yes, a small matter." "Not so small when you're short, ma'am," Caleb said honestly. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Perhaps you would allow me to thank you another way." "We were planning on sending supplies down to the logging camp tomorrow. Could we trouble you to deliver them? It would save Mr. Croft a trip, and we would, of course, pay you for the delivery." Caleb hesitated. It was more time away from his own work, but the offer was framed as a request for help, not charity, and the pay, however small, would be welcome. Besides, there was something in her direct gaze, her lack of airs, that made it hard to refuse. "I reckon I could do that, ma'am," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." Her smile deepened slightly. "Mr. Croft will arrange for the supplies to be brought here to the edge of your property in the morning." With another nod, she turned her horse, Croft falling in behind her, and they rode away, leaving Caleb standing by his makeshift bridge, a strange mix of weariness, satisfaction, and unexpected turmoil stirring within him. He had built a bridge between properties, but somehow it felt like he might have also started building a bridge between two vastly different worlds, and he wasn't at all sure where that bridge might lead. The next morning, as promised, an Ainsworth wagon delivered a load of supplies, sacks of flour, beans, coffee, salted pork, tools, near the bridge. Caleb loaded them carefully onto Bess and a pack mule he borrowed from a neighbor further down the valley. The logging camp was high in the foothills, a rough, temporary settlement of burly men felling timber for the ever-expanding needs of the ranch and the town. It was a hard ride, the trail steep and rocky. He delivered the supplies, accepted the foreman's thanks and the promised payment, and headed back down as the afternoon wore on. As he neared the lower slopes, rounding a bend thick with aspen, he heard a cry, sharp, cut off. He pulled Bess to a halt, listening intently. Silence. Then another sound, a low moan of pain. Dismounting quickly, tying Bess and the mule to a tree, Caleb drew the old Colt Peacemaker tucked into his belt, a precaution he rarely neglected, even if he prayed never to use it, and moved cautiously forward through the trees. He found her 50 yards off the trail. Eleonora Ainsworth. Her fine bay mare lay on its side, leg bent at an unnatural angle, eyes rolling in panic and pain. Eleonora was trapped beneath the fallen horse, her face pale, beaded with sweat, her green riding skirt torn and stained with mud. Her leg was pinned, and she was clearly in agony. "Mrs. Ainsworth!" Caleb exclaimed, rushing forward, holstering his pistol. She looked up, relief flooding her eyes, quickly followed by a grimace of pain. "Mr. Hayes, thank heavens, my horse stumbled through me." "Easy now, ma'am," Caleb said, kneeling beside her, his voice calm despite the urgency. He quickly assessed the situation. The horse was badly injured, likely beyond saving. Eleonora's leg was trapped beneath the animal's heavy flank. Trying to move the horse carelessly could crush her further. He needed leverage, and he needed to end the horse's suffering. His gaze fell on the sturdy branch of a fallen pine nearby. "All right, ma'am," he said, his mind working quickly. "I need to lift the horse just enough to pull you clear. It's gonna hurt, but I need you to stay as still as possible. Can you do that?" She nodded tightly, biting her lip against the pain. "Yes." He worked swiftly, using his knife to trim the pine branch into a thick lever. He wedged one end under the horse's flank, near Eleonora's trapped leg, using a rock as a fulcrum. It was agonizingly slow. He put all his weight onto the lever. The horse groaned, shifted slightly. Eleonora cried out, a sharp intake of breath. "Almost there," Caleb grunted, straining, sweat pouring down his face. He felt the pressure lessen fractionally. "Now!" Gently but firmly, he reached under the horse and pulled Eleonora free, dragging her carefully away from the struggling animal. She lay on the ground, gasping, her face white. Caleb immediately knelt beside her, examining her leg. It wasn't obviously broken, but it was already swelling, scraped raw, and likely badly sprained or worse. The horse let out another pained whinny. Caleb looked at it, then back at Eleonora. His expression was grim. "Ma'am?" The horse. Eleonora closed her eyes for a moment, tears leaking from the corners. "I know," she whispered. Do what you must." Caleb drew his peacemaker again. He hated this part of frontier life, the necessary cruelty. He spoke soothingly to the animal, then placed the muzzle carefully behind its ear. The shot was sharp, final, echoing through the quiet woods. He stood for a moment, the pistol heavy in his hand, then holstered it and turned his full attention back to Eleonora. "We need to get you back to the ranch house, ma'am. Can you ride? I can fetch my mare." She tried to sit up, testing her leg, and cried out again. I don't think so." "The pain," Caleb frowned, thinking quickly. His homestead was closer than the main Ainsworth ranch house, much closer. But taking the wealthy Mrs. Ainsworth, injured and alone, back to his rough cabin? The impropriety, the gossip it would cause. Yet leaving her here while he rode for help seemed unthinkable. Her safety came first. "My cabin's not far from here," he said, making the decision. "It's closer than the ranch. I can get you there, make you comfortable, then ride for Croft and a wagon." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with pain, but also a flicker of surprise, and perhaps gratitude. "Your cabin? It's rough, ma'am, but it's warm and dry, and close." She hesitated only a moment. "All right, Mr. Hayes. Thank you." Getting her there was an ordeal. He retrieved Bess, helped Eleonora onto the mare, walking beside her, supporting her injured leg, moving slowly, painstakingly down the trail. Every jolt sent waves of pain through her, but she bore it with remarkable stoicism, biting her lip, her hands clenched tight on the saddle horn. By the time they reached the small clearing where his cabin stood, twilight was falling, and she was nearly faint with pain and exhaustion. He carried her inside the small one-room cabin. It was rough, yes. Bare plank floors, a simple stone hearth, a narrow cot against one wall, shelves holding his meager possessions. But it was spotlessly clean, orderly. He gently laid her on his cot, the only bed he owned, covering her with his cleanest blanket. "I'll build up the fire," he said softly. "Then I'll fetch water, and I'll ride for help straight away." "No," she whispered, her eyes closed. "Please, just for a moment. The pain." He saw the exhaustion in her face, the plea for respite. Riding off immediately would leave her alone, injured in unfamiliar surroundings. He couldn't do it. "All right, ma'am, just for a bit. Let me see to that leg." He built up the fire, the flickering light casting warm shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He fetched cool water from his well. Gently, carefully, he removed her riding boot, cut away the torn stocking. Her ankle and lower leg were badly swollen, bruised dark purple. He soaked cloths in cool water and bathed the injury, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. He worked in silence, acutely aware of her presence, the intimacy of the situation. The vast gulf between their lives suddenly shrunk to the space of this small lamp-lit room. She watched him, her eyes following his movements. The pain seemed to have subsided slightly, replaced by weariness. "You're very kind, Mr. Hayes," she murmured. Caleb just shook his head, focused on his task. "Anyone would do the same, ma'am." "Perhaps," she said softly, "but not everyone would be so gentle." He finished tending her leg, propping it carefully on a rolled blanket. He brewed strong coffee on the hearth, offering her a cup. She sipped it gratefully. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Less awkward, more companionable. He sat on the rough stool by the hearth, watching the fire, giving her space. He saw her gaze drift around the small cabin, taking in the neatly stacked firewood, the worn books on a shelf, a Bible, Shakespeare, a dog-eared almanac, the simple, sturdy furniture he'd made himself. "You built this all yourself?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am." "It's solid, honest." He didn't know how to respond to that. After a while, her breathing deepened, became more even. Exhaustion and the relief from the worst of the pain had claimed her. She had fallen asleep on his cot. Caleb watched her for a long moment. The firelight softened the lines of weariness on her face, highlighted the curve of her cheek. She looked vulnerable, peaceful. He felt a strange, protective urge, stronger than just duty or gratitude. He quietly banked the fire, checked the door latch, and took another blanket outside. He wouldn't ride for help tonight. Let her rest. Croft could wait till morning. He settled himself against the cabin wall, pulling the rough blanket around his shoulders, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and the quiet breathing of the woman sleeping inside his home. The bridge between their worlds, he realized, was becoming more solid than he could ever have imagined. And the thought filled him not with satisfaction, but with a profound and unsettling sense of impending complication. Dawn broke reluctantly, painting the eastern sky in pale, watery shades of gray and rose. Caleb stirred from a fitful sleep, cramped and stiff from his night spent propped against the cabin wall. The air was sharp, carrying the clean scent of rain-washed earth and pine. His first thought was of her. He rose quietly, stretching his aching muscles, and pushed the cabin door open just enough to peer inside. Eleonora was still asleep, her breathing even, one hand curled near her cheek like a child's. The fire had died down to embers, leaving the small room cool. Her injured leg, propped on the rolled blanket, looked less swollen than last night, though the bruising remained dark and angry against her pale skin. He slipped inside soundlessly, added dry wood to the embers, coaxing them back to life until small flames licked upward, casting a gentle, flickering light. He filled the coffee pot with fresh water from the bucket and set it near the growing heat. Only then did her eyes flutter open. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, taking in the rough log walls, the low ceiling, the unfamiliar surroundings. Then her gaze found Caleb by the hearth, and recognition dawned, followed swiftly by a flush that crept up her neck. "Mr. Hayes," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep. "Good morning." "Morning, ma'am," Caleb replied, keeping his voice low. "How's the leg feeling?" She shifted slightly on the narrow cot, testing it, and winced. "Stiff, painful, but better than last night, I think. Thanks to you." She pushed herself up slightly, trying to sit, her expression determined despite the discomfort. You slept outside?" Caleb nodded, busying himself with the coffee. Seemed best. An awkward silence fell. He was intensely aware of her watching him, of the intimacy forced upon them by circumstance. He, the rough homesteader, tending to the wealthy Mrs. Ainsworth in his bare-bones cabin. It felt like a scene from a fever dream. He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, the only kind he owned, and handed one to her. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second, sending an unexpected jolt through him. "Thank you," she said, cradling the warm mug in her hands. She looked around the cabin again, her gaze lingering on the details. The way his few tools were hung neatly on pegs. The worn but clean blankets folded precisely at the foot of the cot she occupied. The sturdy, simple table and chair he'd obviously crafted himself. "You keep a very orderly home, Mr. Hayes. Not much point in being messy when it's just you," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "Helps find things in the dark." She took a sip of the coffee, her eyes thoughtful over the rim of the mug. "My house, the ranch house, is filled with things, staffed to manage them. Sometimes I think the things manage us." She looked directly at him. "You seem very capable, Mr. Hayes, of managing on your own." "Got no choice, ma'am," he answered simply. "Out here, you learn fast or you don't last." He knew he needed to ride for help now. Delaying further wouldn't be right. "Ma'am, I need to go fetch Mr. Croft and a wagon. Get you back to the ranch where you can be properly tended to." She nodded, though a flicker of something, perhaps apprehension, crossed her face. Yes, of course. You must. But thank you, Caleb, for everything. For your kindness, your discretion. She used his first name, the sound unfamiliar yet strangely natural in the small space. It hung in the air between them. Just glad I was nearby, ma'am, he replied, falling back on formality. He quickly ate a cold biscuit, checked the loads on Bess and the pack mule, and prepared to leave. I'll bar the door from the outside. Shouldn't be gone more'n a few hours. He hesitated at the door. You need anything before I go? She shook her head, managing a small smile. Just your speedy return with Mr. Croft. He nodded, pulled the door shut, and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. Mounting Bess, he turned towards the Ainsworth Ranch, the rising sun warm on his back, but a different kind of heat lingering inside him. A confusing mix of anxiety about the situation, awareness of the social chasm he'd temporarily crossed, and the undeniable memory of Eleanora Ainsworth's moss-green eyes watching him in the firelight. The ride to the Ainsworth Ranch headquarters felt longer than the ride to the logging camp had. His mind churned. How would Croft react? What would the foreman think? Finding his employer had spent the night, however innocently, in a rough homesteader's cabin. Tongues would wag, no doubt about it. Bozeman society, though rougher than Philadelphia, had its own rigid set of expectations, especially for a woman of Eleanora's standing and wealth. He'd done the right thing, the only decent thing. But the potential for scandal, for misinterpretation, was vast. He urged Bess faster, wanting to get this over with. As the grand ranch house came into view, sprawling and imposing against the landscape, the gulf between his world and hers felt wider than ever. He rode directly to the main barn, where he knew he'd likely find Croft organizing the day's work. The foreman was there all right, directing several hands saddling horses. He looked up sharply as Caleb rode in, his expression immediately suspicious. Hayes? What are you doing back here? Thought you were heading home. Caleb swung down from Bess, his face grim. There's been an accident, Mr. Croft. Found Mrs. Ainsworth up in the foothills yesterday afternoon. Her horse fell, legs broken. She's pinned. He deliberately omitted the overnight stay for now, wanting to gauge Croft's reaction. The foreman's face went rigid, his eyes narrowing. What? Where? Is she all right? His concern for Eleanora was sharp, immediate, overriding his suspicion of Caleb for a moment. Horse stumbled off the logging trail, Caleb explained quickly. Managed to get her free, but the horse had to put it down. Her leg's injured, maybe sprained bad, maybe broken. Couldn't move her far. He paused, then met Croft's hard gaze directly. She spent the night at my cabin. It was the closest place, and she couldn't ride. Croft's face darkened, suspicion returning full force, mixed now with anger. His jaw tightened. Your cabin? Alone? She was injured, Croft, Caleb said firmly, keeping his voice level despite the foreman's accusatory tone. Needed shelter. Needed rest before being moved. I came for a wagon as soon as it was light. Croft stared at him for a long, hard moment, searching Caleb's face for any sign of deceit or impropriety. Caleb met his gaze steadily, unflinchingly. Whatever Croft thought of him, Caleb knew he'd acted honorably. Finally, the foreman seemed to make a decision. The immediate safety of his employer was paramount. All right, Hayes, he snapped, turning away abruptly. "Hitch up the buckboard. Murphy, saddle my horse. Johnson, grab blankets, water cask, splint kit from the house." He barked orders, the ranch hands scrambling to obey. He turned back to Caleb. "You ride with me. Show us the way. And Hayes," his voice dropped, low and menacing, "this better be exactly like you say." The journey back to Caleb's homestead was tense. Croft rode in silence, his face a stony mask, occasionally firing sharp questions at Caleb about the location, the horse, the nature of Eleonora's injury. Caleb answered briefly, truthfully. The buckboard, carrying 2 ranch hands and the supplies, rattled along behind them. When they finally reached the small clearing, the cabin looked quiet, unassuming in the bright morning sun. Croft swung down before his horse even stopped, striding towards the door, Caleb close behind. Caleb lifted the bar, pushed the door open. Eleonora was awake, sitting up slightly on the cot, her hair tidied as best she could, her expression composed despite the obvious pain lines around her eyes. Relief washed over Croft's face, quickly masked by his usual gruffness. "Mrs. Ainsworth, thank God. Are you badly hurt?" "Silas." Eleanor's voice was calm, steady. "I'm all right. My leg needs attention, but Mr. Hayes here acted with remarkable speed and kindness. Without him..." She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. She looked pointedly at Caleb, then back at Croft. "He brought me to the only available shelter when I couldn't be moved further. I am deeply indebted to him." Croft grunted, acknowledging Caleb with a stiff nod that might have contained a fraction less suspicion than before. "We'll get you home right away, ma'am." The process of moving Eleonora was slow and careful. The ranch hands were surprisingly gentle, constructing a makeshift stretcher, lifting her carefully onto the bed of straw prepared in the buckboard. Caleb helped where he could, steadying the stretcher, offering quiet reassurance. Through it all, Eleonora maintained her composure, though Caleb saw her bite her lip hard against the pain more than once. As they prepared to depart, Eleonora called out from the wagon, "Mr. Hayes?" Caleb approached the buckboard. "Ma'am?" "Thank you," she said again, her voice low, but carrying conviction. Her eyes met his, holding a depth of gratitude that went beyond mere words. "Truly, I won't forget this." Croft, overhearing, cleared his throat impatiently. "We need to get moving, ma'am." Eleonora ignored him, her gaze still on Caleb. Then, with a slight nod, she settled back against the blankets. The buckboard lurched forward, Croft and the other riders falling in alongside, heading back towards the world where she belonged. Caleb stood alone in the clearing, watching them go until they disappeared from view. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. His cabin door stood open, the cot inside empty, the faint scent of her presence already fading. He turned slowly, surveyed his small domain, the fields needing tending, the wood needing chopping, the endless cycle of work waiting. He had stepped across a line, entered another world for a brief, intense period. Now, he was back. But something felt different. The solitude that had been his constant companion now felt heavier, tinged with the memory of shared vulnerability, of a connection forged in crisis. He shook his head, trying to clear it. He was a homesteader. She was the wealthy widow Ainsworth. Their paths weren't meant to cross again. He picked up his axe and walked towards the woodpile, determined to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of hard labor. Back at the sprawling Ainsworth Ranch, Eleonora was installed in her large, airy bedroom, the town doctor summoned from Bozeman. Dr. Mallory, a fussy, gray-haired man, examined her leg, tut-tutting over the swelling and bruising. A severe sprain, Mrs. Ainsworth. Possibly some torn ligaments. No clean break, thankfully. But you'll need complete rest for several weeks. Keep it elevated. Cold compresses. He bustled about, applying bandages, giving instructions to the concerned housekeeper. Silas Croft stood guard outside the door, his face grim. Alastair Finch, the lawyer, arrived soon after, ostensibly to inquire after her health, but clearly also fishing for details, his eyes sharp and assessing. Eleonora answered their questions politely, but volunteered little about her night in Caleb's cabin, sticking to the facts of the accident and rescue. Lying back against the plump pillows, a stark contrast to Caleb's rough cot, she felt the familiar constraints of her life settle back around her like a silken shroud. The quiet competence of the doctor, the hovering concern of her staff, the smooth inquiries of Finch, even Croft's fierce, almost suffocating loyalty. It was all part of the role she was expected to play. Wealthy widow Ainsworth, capable, composed, untouchable. But her mind kept drifting back to the small, clean cabin. To the man with the rough hands and the quiet, steady gaze who had tended her injury with surprising gentleness, who had shared his meager coffee, who had slept outside his own home to preserve her dignity. A man who lived a life stripped bare, yet seemed whole, in a way the wealthy, striving men she knew in Bozeman were not. She found herself comparing Finch's polished phrases to Caleb's simple honesty, Croft's rigid control to Caleb's quiet capability. The comparison was unsettling. A few days later, restless and confined to her room, she asked Croft about Caleb. "Has Mr. Hayes been compensated for his trouble?" Croft shifted uncomfortably. "He refused payment for the bridge work, ma'am, and for assisting you." "See that he receives a generous sum," Eleonora instructed firmly. "For his time, for the use of his home, for his considerable trouble." "Yes, ma'am," Croft said, though his disapproval was evident. "But Mrs. Ainsworth, if I may be frank, associating with a man like Hayes, a homesteader, it will cause talk. It's not fitting." Eleonora's eyes flashed, a spark of the spirit Jeremiah Ainsworth must have seen in her. "Mr. Croft, that man likely saved my life, and certainly saved me from a night of agony on the mountainside. He acted with honor and decency. Talk or no talk, fitting or not, his kindness will be acknowledged. See to the payment." Croft bowed stiffly. "As you wish, ma'am." But Eleonora knew Croft's warning wasn't baseless. She had already heard the whispers among the household staff, seen the curious glances. Her unplanned night in Caleb Hayes's cabin was becoming fodder for gossip, and the thought, instead of alarming her, filled her with a strange mix of indignation and defiance. Why shouldn't she associate with an honest, capable man simply because he worked his own land with his own hands? What made Alastair Finch, with his smooth manners and calculating eyes, inherently better? Caleb, meanwhile, tried to force his life back into its old grooves. He worked his fields, repaired his fence, hunted for meat. But the solitude felt different. The silence of the cabin at night seemed to echo with unspoken words. The memory of Eleonora's presence, a tangible thing. He found himself thinking about her recovery, wondering how she was faring back in her grand house. He told himself it was just gratitude, a natural concern for someone he'd helped. But deep down, a part of him knew it was more than that. He felt a connection, a spark of understanding that had passed between them in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, something that defied the vast difference in their stations. One afternoon, while splitting firewood, he saw a rider approaching. Not Croft this time, but one of the younger Ainsworth ranch hands. The young man looked uncomfortable as he handed Caleb a small, heavy pouch. "From Mrs. Ainsworth, Mr. Hayes, for your help." Caleb took the pouch. Gold coins. Far more than his time or trouble was worth. It felt like charity, like an attempt to settle a debt and reestablish the distance between them. "Tell Mrs. Ainsworth I thank her," Caleb said, his voice stiff. "But this is too much." "She insisted, sir," the hand mumbled, eager to be gone. Said she'd appreciate it if you'd accept." Caleb watched the rider depart, the pouch heavy in his hand. He didn't want her money. He wasn't sure what he wanted. Maybe just the simple acknowledgement that what had passed between them wasn't something that could be paid off and forgotten. He went inside, tossed the pouch onto the table. It landed with a dull thud, seeming out of place in the simple room. His gaze fell on the worn books on his shelf. An idea sparked. He couldn't return the money without causing offense, perhaps, but he could offer something else, something of himself. He spent the evening carefully carving a small, intricate bird, a meadowlark, out of a piece of scrap pine, using the small knife he always carried. His rough hands moved with surprising dexterity, a skill honed during long, solitary winter evenings. He smoothed the wood, brought out the grain, captured the bird's alert posture. It wasn't much, but it was made by his own hands, offered freely. The next day, he rode towards the Ainsworth Ranch, not to the main house, but skirting it, heading towards the rise where he knew Eleonora sometimes rode when she was well. He carried the small wooden bird carefully wrapped in a piece of clean cloth. He wasn't sure what he'd do, how he'd give it to her. Maybe he'd just leave it somewhere he knew she'd find it. As he neared the familiar territory, he saw a buggy stopped near a stand of cottonwoods by the river. Silas Croft stood beside it, arms crossed, looking impatient, and sitting on a blanket spread on the grass, her injured leg propped up, sketching in a small notebook, was Eleonora. She looked up as Caleb approached, surprise and something else, pleasure, lighting up her face. Croft turned, his expression immediately hardening as he saw Caleb. "Hayes, what do you want?" Caleb ignored him, dismounting, walking towards Eleonora, holding out the small, cloth-wrapped object. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for your generosity. It was too much, but I wanted to give you this. Just a small thing." Eleonora took the bundle, her fingers brushing his again. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing the small wooden meadowlark. A soft gasp escaped her. She looked at the bird, then up at Caleb, her eyes shining. "Oh, Caleb, It's beautiful. Did you make this? He nodded, feeling awkward again. Just something I do sometimes. It's exquisite, she breathed, tracing the smooth lines of the wood with her fingertip. Thank you, I'll treasure it. Croft cleared his throat loudly. Mrs. Ainsworth, we should be getting back. Dr. Mallory said only a short outing. Eleonora shot Croft an annoyed glance. In a moment, Silas. She looked back at Caleb, a decision seeming to form in her eyes. Caleb, would you join me for a moment? Tell me about the homestead, about the crops this year? Croft looked thunderous, but Caleb, meeting Eleonora's direct, inviting gaze, felt his resolve crumble. He sat down on the edge of the blanket, keeping a respectful distance, and began to talk, hesitantly at first, then more easily, about the challenges of the soil, the hope for rain, the small triumphs of his solitary life. And Eleonora listened, truly listened, asking questions, her earlier reserve replaced by genuine interest. For a short while, under the shade of the cottonwoods, they weren't the wealthy widow and the poor homesteader. They were just a man and a woman, talking, connecting, bridging the gap between their worlds, one shared moment at a time. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling of Croft's disapproving stare boring into his back, a tangible reminder of the lines they were crossing, and the trouble that Defiance was almost certain to bring. Caleb rode away from that streamside meeting under the cottonwoods with a heart lighter than it had been in years, but also heavier with foreboding. Eleonora's genuine delight in his simple carving, the easy way she'd drawn him into conversation, the unguarded interest in her eyes. It was like finding an unexpected spring in the middle of the desert. Refreshing, life-giving, but maybe dangerous too. Springs draw attention. He couldn't shake the image of Silas Croft's face, tight with disapproval, a storm cloud on the edge of a sunny clearing. Croft's loyalty to the Ainsworth name was legend, fierce and absolute. And in Croft's eyes, Caleb Hayes was clearly a complication, a trespasser straying far beyond his station. Back in the familiar solitude of his cabin, the carved meadowlark now gone, Caleb felt the encounter linger. He tried to dismiss it. She was kind, grateful for his help. He was a neighbor, offering a simple thank you, nothing more. But honesty, even in the privacy of his own thoughts, compelled him to admit it felt like more. It felt like a door opening, just a crack, into a room he'd never expected to see, let alone enter. He threw himself back into his work with renewed, almost frantic energy, repairing the flood-damaged fence, clearing rocks from a new patch he hoped to cultivate, working until exhaustion claimed him each night. Work was his refuge, the familiar ache in his muscles a welcome distraction from the unfamiliar ache in his chest. Eleonora, too, felt the ripples of that meeting long after Croft had driven her back to the ranch house. She placed the small wooden meadowlark on the polished mahogany table beside her bed, where its simple, handcrafted lines stood in stark contrast to the ornate silver picture frames and porcelain figurines. It felt more real, somehow, than any of them. She found herself smiling whenever her gaze fell upon it. Croft's disapproval had been palpable, almost suffocating during the ride home. He hadn't spoken a word until they reached the house, then merely said, stiffly, "Ma'am, it ain't wise. A man like that?" Eleonora had cut him off, her voice sharper than usual. "A man like that acted with honor when I needed help, Silas, which is more than I might expect from some of the wise gentlemen you seem to approve of. His station in life is irrelevant to his character." Croft had clamped his jaw shut, but his disapproval radiated off him like heat from a forge. The incident solidified something in Eleonora. She was tired of living according to the invisible, stifling rules dictated by her late husband's position and wealth. Jeremiah had been a good man, ambitious and driven, but he had also seen her, she sometimes felt, as another acquisition, a beautiful, cultured wife to adorn his frontier empire. He hadn't truly seen her. Caleb Hayes, in their brief encounters, seemed to see past the Ainsworth name, past the fine clothes, to the woman beneath. He spoke plainly, honestly, without flattery or calculation. It was unnerving and deeply compelling. Her recovery progressed steadily. Soon, Dr. Mallory pronounced her fit enough for short rides, provided she didn't strain the injured leg. Silas Croft insisted on accompanying her, his presence a constant, silent reproach whenever her rides took her, as they increasingly did, towards the southern boundaries of the ranch, towards the foothills where Caleb's small homestead lay nestled. She told herself she needed the air, the change of scenery. She told Croft she was inspecting the fences, the grazing land, but both knew, unspoken, that she was hoping for another chance encounter. It came a week later. She saw him from a distance, working on the roof of his small barn, replacing shingles loosened by the storm. Acting on impulse, she turned her mare off the main track, urging her towards the homestead, ignoring Croft's immediate low growl of protest. "Ma'am, this ain't proper." "I wish to thank Mr. Hayes again for his assistance, Silas," she said coolly, not looking back. "Is common courtesy now considered improper?" Caleb looked up, startled, as she rode into his clearing. He quickly scrambled down the rough ladder, wiping sawdust from his hands on his trousers. "Mrs. Ainsworth," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you out this way again so soon." Croft reined in sharply behind her, his face like thunder. "Just checking the roof before the weather turns," Caleb added unnecessarily, feeling the need to explain his presence on his own land under Croft's accusing stare. "It seems sturdy," Eleonora observed, her gaze taking in the neat repairs. She maneuvered her horse closer, lowering her voice slightly. "Caleb, I wanted to apologize if my foreman's manner was abrupt the other day." Caleb glanced at Croft, who glared back, then looked back at Eleonora. "Mr. Croft is protective of you, ma'am. Understandable." "Protective to a fault sometimes," she murmured. An awkward pause stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the wind sighing through the pines and Croft shifting impatiently in his saddle. "Would you care for some water, ma'am?" Caleb offered, gesturing towards the cabin. "It's a warm day for riding." Before Eleonora could reply, Croft interrupted, his voice tight. "We won't trouble you, Hayes. Mrs. Ainsworth needs to be getting back." Eleonora shot Croft a look that could have chipped ice. "Actually, Silas, a drink of water sounds lovely. Thank you, Caleb." She swung down carefully from her mare, favoring her injured leg only slightly now. Ignoring Croft's simmering fury, she walked beside Caleb towards the cabin. leaving the foreman standing stiffly by the horses. A thunderous guardian denied entry. Inside the small cabin, Eleonora looked around again, a sense of familiarity settling over her. Caleb ladled cool water from the bucket into one of his tin mugs, wiped it carefully, and handed it to her. "Thank you." She drank slowly, savoring the coolness, her eyes meeting Caleb's over the rim. "It's peaceful here," she said quietly. "Hard work," Caleb replied, "but yes, quiet." "Sometimes the ranch house feels too full of echoes," she confessed, surprising herself with the admission. "Echoes of Jeremiah, echoes of expectation." He just nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He didn't offer platitudes, just quiet empathy. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the shared understanding needing no words. Then, the sound of Croft clearing his throat loudly from outside broke the spell. Eleonora sighed. "I suppose I should heed my watchdog," she said, a wry twist to her lips. She handed the mug back to Caleb. "Thank you again, Caleb, for the water, for—" She hesitated. "For the peace." She turned and walked back out, leaving Caleb standing in the doorway, the simple tin mug feeling warm in his hand from her touch. He watched her mount her horse, exchange a few sharp, low words with Croft, and ride away. This time, he knew it wasn't just chance bringing her here. She had sought him out. And that knowledge sent a jolt of mingled elation and deep unease through him. The incident did not go unnoticed. Croft, tight-lipped and furious, reported the unnecessary detour to Alistair Finch on his next visit to town. Finch, the lawyer handling the Ainsworth estate, was a man whose ambition was as sharply pressed as his city suits. He had long harbored hopes of eventually marrying the wealthy widow himself, consolidating his position and gaining control of the Ainsworth fortune. Eleonora's polite but firm rejections of his subtle advances had only strengthened his resolve. The news that she was showing undue interest in some backwoods homesteader named Hayes ignited a cold spark of alarm and jealousy within him. A nobody homesteader? Unthinkable, unacceptable. Finch decided it was time he paid Mrs. Ainsworth another visit and perhaps learned more about this Mr. Hayes. His visit to the ranch a few days later was smooth, solicitous. He inquired after Eleonora's health, complimented her resilience, discussed estate matters with practiced ease. Then, casually, he steered the conversation. "Silas mentioned you had another small adventure near the foothills, Eleonora. Something about meeting that homesteader fellow again? Hayes, wasn't it?" Eleonora stiffened slightly, but kept her voice even. "Mr. Hayes happened to be repairing his property near where I was riding. I merely stopped to thank him again for his considerable help during my accident." Finch smiled, a thin, knowing expression. "Of course. Admirable gratitude. Though one must be careful, mustn't one? Associating too closely with, well, with individuals below one's station can lead to unfortunate gossip. People might misunderstand such kindness." His tone was light, almost bantering, but the underlying warning was clear as glass. Protect your reputation. Remember your place. Eleonora felt a surge of anger. "My station, as you call it, Alistair, does not preclude me from showing basic courtesy and gratitude to a decent man who rendered me a great service, and I assure you, I am quite capable of managing my own associations and any resulting gossip." Her sharp tone surprised Finch, wiping the condescending smile from his face. He quickly retreated, murmuring apologies, changing the subject back to legal matters. But the exchange left Eleonora feeling cornered, resentful. Finch's smug assumption that he, or society, had the right to dictate her friendships, her choices, grated on her independent spirit. His interference, meant to warn her off, had the opposite effect. It strengthened her resolve. Why shouldn't she see Caleb Hayes if she wished? What right did Finch, or Croft, or the gossiping townspeople have to judge? Caleb, meanwhile, faced his own escalating pressures. On his next trip to Bozeman for supplies, a trip he now undertook with a mix of reluctance and a faint, unacknowledged hope of seeing Eleonora, the atmosphere felt different. The clerk at the mercantile, who had witnessed the incident with the axe head, now gave him sideways glances filled with speculation. Two ranchers, Caleb knew, slightly nodded curtly, but didn't engage in their usual banter about crops and weather. As he was leaving the store, he overheard two well-dressed women talking near a buggy, their voices carrying clearly. The Ainsworth widow, spending time out at some dirt farmer's hovel. Can you imagine? Scandalous. Poor Jeremiah must be spinning in his grave. They say the foreman is fit to be tied. Caleb felt his face burn. He quickened his pace, untied Bess, and mounted, eager to escape the suffocating judgment of the town. So, the gossip had spread. He wasn't surprised, but the reality of it, the casual cruelty of the whispers, hit him hard. It wasn't just his own reputation, which mattered little to him. It was Eleonora's. His presence in her life, however tangential, was causing her embarrassment, potentially damaging her standing. Was his own growing fascination, his quiet hope for connection, worth putting her through that? The question gnawed at him all the way back to the homestead. He felt caught in a trap, not of his making. To seek her out felt wrong, selfish, given the trouble it caused her. To stay away felt like betraying the fragile, unexpected bond that had formed between them. He looked around his small cabin, suddenly seeing it through the eyes of the gossiping townspeople. A hovel, the home of a dirt farmer. Was Finch right? Was he dragging her down simply by existing near her orbit? Eleonora, however, was not one to be easily deterred once her mind was set. Fueled by her resentment of Finch's interference and a growing certainty about her own feelings, she decided on a bold, perhaps reckless, course of action. She knew Caleb often supplemented his meager income by selling high-quality timber he cut selectively from the wooded slopes of his property. Using the skills he demonstrated building the bridge. The Ainsworth Ranch always needed timber for fences, repairs, firewood. She instructed Silas Croft to place a substantial order for cut timber with Mr. Hayes, specifying delivery directly to the main ranch yard over the next few weeks. Croft protested vehemently. "Ma'am, we have our own logging crews. There's no need." "Our crews are busy further up the valley, Silas," Eleonora countered coolly, meeting his glare. "Mr. Hayes's property is closer for smaller, specific loads like fence posts. It's simply practical, and I wish to offer him the business. Is that clear?" Croft's jaw worked, but he couldn't argue with a direct order regarding ranch business. He clamped his mouth shut and nodded stiffly. "As you wish, ma'am." Eleonora knew she was playing with fire, She was using the ranch's resources, her authority as its owner, to create legitimate reasons for Caleb to come to the very heart of her world, defying Croft, Finch, and the town's expectations head-on. It was a gamble. It could backfire spectacularly. But it was a way to see him, to interact with him on more equal footing, within the boundaries, however strained, of business. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was a way to show everyone, including Caleb himself, that she would not be swayed by gossip or prejudice. When Croft rode out to Caleb's homestead a few days later to deliver the timber order, his face was like carved granite. He relayed Mrs. Ainsworth's instructions curtly, his tone implying this was a foolish whim he was forced to endure. Caleb listened, stunned. A large, regular timber order? Delivered to the ranch? It was good money, work he knew well, but the implications were enormous. This wasn't a chance encounter or a rescue. This was deliberate. Eleonora was inviting him into her world, openly, under the guise of business. He looked at Croft's thunderous expression, thought of the gossiping women in town, felt the weight of Eleonora's reputation. His first instinct was to refuse, to protect her from further talk, to retreat back to the safety of his isolation. But then he thought of Eleonora's face, the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she'd listened to him under the cottonwoods. Refusing would be an insult to her, a surrender to the very forces they both seemed to despise. It would be letting the gossips and the snobs win. He met Croft's glare with a steady look of his own. "All right, Mr. Croft," Caleb said, his voice firm. "You tell Mrs. Ainsworth I accept the order. The first delivery will be ready by the end of the week." Croft just grunted, wheeled his horse, and rode off, leaving Caleb standing in the middle of his hardscrabble life, now formally contracted to enter the lion's den. The conflict wasn't just simmering anymore. Eleonora had just turned up the heat, and Caleb knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the real trouble was just beginning. The timber deliveries began. Caleb worked relentlessly, felling trees with practiced skill, cutting them to the precise lengths specified in the order. Fence posts mostly, some heavier beams for barn repairs. Loading the wagon was heavy work, the journey to the main Ainsworth ranch yard even heavier in a way. Each trip felt like running a gauntlet. The Ainsworth hands, loyal to Croft and likely fueled by gossip, watched him with veiled hostility or open curiosity. Some offered grudging help unloading. Others simply stood back, making him feel like an unwelcome intruder. Silas Croft was a constant looming presence. He inspected each load meticulously, measuring lengths, checking counts, clearly looking for any fault, any reason to cancel the arrangement. His interactions with Caleb were clipped, bordering on hostile. "This load seems light, Hayes. These posts are rougher than usual." Caleb met each implied accusation calmly, pointing out the exact count, the quality of the wood, refusing to be baited. He knew Croft was testing him, trying to drive him away. But the hardest part was the brief, stolen moments when Eleonora would appear. Under the guise of inspecting the deliveries or consulting with Croft about ranch matters, she would find a way to exchange a few words with Caleb. A quiet inquiry about his homestead, a shared observation about the changing colors in the foothills, a simple smile that spoke volumes more than words could convey in front of watchful eyes. These moments were fleeting, charged with unspoken feelings, yet they were enough. Enough to fuel Caleb's resolve, enough to make Eleonora increasingly certain of the path she was choosing, however fraught with difficulty. She saw the way Croft treated him, the subtle ostracism from the ranch hands, and it only solidified her determination. She saw Caleb's quiet dignity in the face of it, his refusal to stoop, his simple honesty, and her respect deepened into something warmer, stronger. Alistair Finch watched this development with cold fury. His carefully laid plans to woo the widow Ainsworth were being thwarted by a dirt-poor homesteader. Croft's reports confirmed that Eleonora was manufacturing reasons to interact with Hayes, her defiance growing more apparent. Finch realized polite warnings and veiled threats were insufficient. He needed to remove Hayes from the picture definitively, discredit him so thoroughly that Eleonora would be forced, by scandal and practicality, to sever all ties. His lawyer's mind, usually employed in twisting contracts and finding loopholes, turned to darker stratagems. He couldn't challenge Hayes to a duel. Finch wasn't a gunman, and besides, it would elevate the homesteader. No, the attack needed to be subtle, aimed at Hayes's character and livelihood, and designed to implicate Eleonora's judgment. The timber contract provided the perfect opportunity. Finch cultivated a disgruntled Ainsworth hand, a man named Pike with a gambling debt Finch quietly covered, planting seeds of resentment against the outsider Hayes taking work from real ranch hands. He instructed Pike to subtly sabotage some of Caleb's deliveries, hiding a few high-quality tools from the ranch workshop amongst the delivered timber, marking livestock near Caleb's property line as if prepared for rustling, shorting the count on a load after Caleb had departed, but before Croft did his official tally. It was insidious, designed to build a pattern of small discrepancies, of suspicious circumstances, culminating in a discovery that would paint Caleb as a thief and a cheat. The first hint of trouble came when Croft, tallying a load of fence posts Caleb had delivered the day before, declared the count short by 10 posts. "Count 'em yourself, Hayes," Croft said, his voice laced with suspicion. "They were all there when I left my property," Caleb stated calmly, though a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He recounted, Croft watching like a hawk. The count was indeed short. Caleb frowned, perplexed. He knew he'd loaded the correct number. "Must have shifted, fallen off on the trail," Caleb suggested, though the explanation felt weak even to him. "Or maybe," Croft sneered, "your counting ain't what it should be." The next week, it was a missing branding iron, found tucked away near Caleb's woodpile by Pike, who happened to be checking fences nearby. Caleb protested vehemently. He had no use for an Ainsworth branding iron, no reason to take it. But the seed of doubt was planted, watered by the existing prejudice. Then came the most damaging incident. Pike, following Finch's instructions, altered the markings on 2 Ainsworth calves grazing near Caleb's property line, making it look like an amateur attempt to change the brand, and then discovered them, raising the alarm about rustling. This was serious. Rustling was a hanging offense in the territory, or at least grounds for vigilante justice. Croft, presented with this accumulating evidence by Pike, and fueled by his own dislike of Caleb, finally went to Eleonora, his face grim. "Ma'am, I warned you about Hayes. He's shorting deliveries, tools are going missing, and now Pike's found calves near his place with brands altered. The man's a thief, maybe worse." Eleonora listened, her heart sinking. Could she have been so wrong about Caleb? Was his quiet honesty just a mask? The accusations, especially the rustling, were deeply troubling. Yet, it didn't feel right. It didn't align with the man who had tended her injury with such care, who had carved the delicate meadowlark, who met hostility with quiet dignity. "Where is the proof, Silas?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Circumstantial, maybe," Croft admitted grudgingly, "but it paints a damning picture. The men are talking. Finch heard about the calves, says the law might need involving." Finch. Eleonora's eyes narrowed. Finch's convenient timing, his readiness to involve the law. A cold suspicion began to form in her own mind. This felt orchestrated. "I want to speak with Mr. Hayes myself, Silas," she declared, "before involving anyone else." Croft looked aghast. "Ma'am, that ain't wise. If he's desperate, I will speak with him," Eleonora repeated firmly. "Have him brought to the study. And Silas, ensure Mr. Finch is not informed of this meeting." Caleb arrived at the ranch house, escorted by two grim-faced hands, feeling a sense of dread. He was shown into the large, imposing study, Jeremiah Ainsworth's domain, filled with leather-bound books, maps, hunting trophies. Eleonora stood by the fireplace, her back to him. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes searching his. Croft stood near the door, arms crossed, a silent accuser. "Caleb," Eleonora began, her voice strained. "Mr. Croft has brought serious accusations against you. Short deliveries, missing tools, altered brands on calves near your property." Caleb met her gaze directly, his own expression a mixture of hurt and bewildered anger. "Ma'am, I swear to you, I haven't stolen anything. The post count was right when I left. That branding iron, I never touched it. And those calves, I wouldn't." "The evidence suggests otherwise, Hayes," Croft interjected harshly. "Silence, Silas," Eleonora commanded, her eyes never leaving Caleb's face. She saw no deceit there, only shock, and the deep hurt of betrayal. She saw the same quiet honesty she had trusted in the cabin, under the cottonwoods. This was the emotional twist she hadn't foreseen. Not a betrayal by Caleb, but a calculated attack on him, designed to force her hand. And in that moment, her choice became clear. Her loyalty wasn't to the whispers of the town or the expectations of her station. It was to the truth and to the character of the man standing before her. "I believe you, Caleb," she said quietly, but with absolute conviction. Caleb stared at her, stunned. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. Croft looked flabbergasted. "Ma'am, you can't just—" "I can," Eleonora stated firmly. "This feels wrong, too convenient, especially Mr. Finch's sudden interest." She turned to Croft. "Silas, think. Hayes has had opportunity before, delivering timber, working near our borders. Why now? Why these petty incidents escalating just as certain people notice my friendship with him?" Croft frowned, processing Eleonora's words. His dislike of Caleb warred with his loyalty to her, and his innate sense of fairness. He had found Finch's eagerness suspicious. He remembered Pike's unusual nervousness when reporting the calves. "Pike," Croft muttered. "He found the iron, found the calves." "Exactly," Eleanora pressed. "Silas, I want you to watch Pike, quietly. See who he talks to, where he goes. I suspect he's not acting alone." Croft hesitated, then gave a curt nod. His loyalty to Eleanora and his suspicion of outside interference won out over his prejudice against Caleb. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanora looked back at Caleb, her expression softening. "Caleb, I am deeply sorry you were subjected to this. It seems we have enemies we did not anticipate. Or maybe," Caleb said grimly, thinking of Finch, "enemies you already knew, ma'am." The confrontation, the climax of Finch's scheme, came not subtly, but in a calculated public ambush a few days later. Finch, having learned through Pike that Eleanora was standing by Hayes despite the evidence, decided to force the issue publicly. He arranged to encounter Eleanora at the Mercantile during her weekly trip to town for supplies and business. Knowing Caleb would likely be there as well, making a delivery or buying necessities, Finch brought the Bozeman sheriff with him, a portly, officious man named Henderson. As Eleanora emerged from the Mercantile, Finch stepped forward, bowing slightly, but with malice gleaming in his eyes. Sheriff Henderson stood beside him, looking uncomfortable but determined. A small crowd, sensing drama, began to gather. Caleb, who had just finished loading supplies onto his wagon nearby, saw the setup and his stomach clenched. "Eleanora, my dear," Finch began, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Forgive this intrusion, but a matter of justice requires addressing. Sheriff Henderson has received disturbing reports regarding thefts and suspected rustling implicating your associate, Mr. Hayes." He gestured towards Caleb, who stood frozen by his wagon. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People stared openly at Caleb, then at Eleanora, waiting for her reaction. This was it, the public accusation, the attempt to shame her into abandoning Caleb. Sheriff Henderson cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes, I'll need to ask you some questions." But before he could continue, Eleanora stepped forward, her posture radiating calm authority. She ignored Finch completely, addressing the sheriff directly, her voice clear and steady. "Sheriff Henderson, before you proceed, perhaps you should know that these reports are based on highly questionable circumstances, likely orchestrated by Mr. Finch himself." Another wave of murmurs swept the crowd. Finch paled, sputtering. "How dare you? That's slander!" "Is it, Alistair?" Eleanora turned to face him, her eyes like chips of green ice. "Is it slander to suggest your sudden concern for justice coincides perfectly with your thwarted ambitions regarding my late husband's estate, and perhaps myself? Is it slander to point out that the evidence against Mr. Hayes conveniently appeared only after you expressed disapproval of our acquaintance?" She then turned back to the crowd, her voice ringing with conviction. "I know Caleb Hayes. He is an honest man, a man of integrity, who rendered me invaluable service when I was injured. These accusations are baseless, malicious lies, likely fed to you by this man." She pointed directly at Finch and his paid informants. Just then, Silas Croft pushed through the crowd. He looked uncomfortable, but resolute. "Sheriff," Croft said gruffly, "Mrs. Ainsworth is right to be suspicious. I've been watching that hand, Pike. Saw him meeting secretly with Finch just yesterday. Passed him money. And the markings on those calves, they weren't right. Looked fresh, deliberately clumsy. The crowd gasped again. Croft, the loyal Ainsworth foreman, siding against Finch and with the homesteader? It was stunning. Sheriff Henderson looked from Finch's now apoplectic face to Croft's stony one, to Eleonora's unwavering gaze, and finally to Caleb, who simply stood tall, meeting the stares without flinching. The sheriff, no fool despite his officiousness, sensed the tide turning, smelled the stench of a conspiracy unraveling. "Mr. Finch," Henderson said sternly, "perhaps you have some explaining to do." Finch, exposed and humiliated, his face contorted with rage, could only stammer denials before turning tail and practically fleeing down the street, the mocking laughter of the crowd following him. Eleonora walked over to Caleb, ignoring the stares, and placed a hand gently on his arm. "Are you all right, Caleb?" He looked down at her, gratitude and something much deeper shining in his eyes. "Thanks to you, Eleonora." In that moment, standing together in the dusty main street of Bozeman, they had faced down the accusations, the prejudice, the rules that tried to keep them apart. They had chosen each other, publicly, definitively. The dust settled quickly after Finch's public humiliation. He left Bozeman soon after, his reputation in tatters. Pike, the disgruntled hand, also vanished. Silas Croft, having seen Finch's treachery and Caleb's quiet strength under pressure, offered Caleb a grudging, almost imperceptible nod of respect the next time he delivered timber, a silent acknowledgement that character mattered more than station. The gossip didn't disappear overnight, of course. Tongues still wagged, eyebrows were still raised. But now there was a grudging admiration mixed in. Eleonora Ainsworth had stood by her man, regardless of his background, and Caleb Hayes had proven himself worthy of her trust. Eleonora and Caleb continued to see each other, more openly now. She rode out to his homestead, sharing simple meals in the cabin, talking for hours about everything and nothing. He came to the ranch, sometimes for business, sometimes just to walk with her by the river. They were careful, mindful of appearances still, but no longer hiding. They were building their bridge, timber by timber, shared glance by shared glance. One cool evening, sitting by the hearth in Caleb's cabin, the firelight dancing on their faces, Eleonora looked at him, her eyes serious. "Caleb," she said softly, "the world may not understand. They may never fully accept us. Are you prepared for that?" Caleb reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his rough fingers closing gently around hers. "Eleonora," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "with you beside me, I reckon I can face down the whole damn world." She smiled, a radiant, trusting smile that lit up the small cabin brighter than any lamp. Their love, born in crisis, nurtured in defiance, had found its footing. It wouldn't be easy. The rules of the West, the lines of class and wealth, were stubborn things, but they would face it together. And so, the poor farmer and the wealthy widow found their way, not by changing who they were, but by having the courage to see past the surface, to value the heart above the holdings. Their story reminds us, doesn't it, that the rules society writes are often just flimsy fences, easily knocked down by genuine affection and stubborn courage. Out here, where life strips you bare, character is the true measure of a man or a woman. Not the size of their land, nor the weight of their purse. Love can bloom in the rockiest soil if you give it half a chance, if you're brave enough to tend it, brave enough to defy the rules that say it shouldn't belong there. That's a truth worth holding on to, as enduring as the mountains themselves. Think on that. Think about the lines folks draw and the courage it takes to step across them for the right reasons. If this story of Caleb and Eleonora resonated with you, share it with folks who believe in the power of the human heart to overcome obstacles. Let us know your thoughts down below. What are the Wild West rules in our own lives that sometimes need defying? These stories connect us when we talk about them. And be sure to subscribe, because the West is full of tales of unexpected love and quiet courage, just waiting for their turn by the fire.